LeBron James, D Wade, and all of these guys, when we look at them as superstars, I cannot give you the superstar label because in all the years, the same amount of time that LeBron James has been in this league, that LeBron James doesn't have any rings. At some point in time, we have to look at you and we have to sit there and say, you got to give us more appearances.
There was a moment in March 2025 that stopped the entire NBA world in its tracks. LeBron James, a man who had won 4 championships and spent over 20 years in the spotlight, walked up to one of the most powerful voices in the sports media and got right in his face. The cameras caught everything. The look on the LeBron's face wasn't the face of an athlete defending his stats or his legacy. It was the face of a father who, and he said, was simple and straight from the heart. You got to stop talking about my son. That's my son. That's my son. Within hours, the entire internet felt it. But to understand why that moment happened, you have to go back a few months earlier because this didn't start with a confrontation. It started with a microphone and a man named Stephen A. Smith, who was never afraid to say what was on his mind, no matter what who to hurt. It was early 2025 when Stephen A sat down on first take and started talking about the Bronny James. Bronny wasn't just a rookie, he was LeBron's son, and that LeBron had publicly dreamed about the playing alongside for years. In 2024, the dream became real when the Lakers drafted Bronny 55th overall, and LeBron called it a greatest accomplishment of his basketball life, bigger than any trophy or record. But Bronny's early NBA numbers were not good, and Stephen A made sure everyone knew it. In 13 games, Bronny had shot 1 of 416 from the field and averaged less than 1 point per game. Stephen A looked into the camera and said what many were too afraid to say. He said Bronny was only the NBA because of his father, and that millions of other kids were more qualified. He even pleaded with LeBron on live television saying, stop this. And then he compared the whole situation to a boxer's son being thrown into the ring completely unprepared and getting knocked out cold. Those words landed hard, but what Stephen A didn't give enough weight to was the fact that Bronny had suffered a cardiac arrest in July 2023, collapsed on the court at USC, and spent 3 days in the hospital just trying to survive. His entire development had been set back by the something no young athlete should have ever had to face, and yet none of this seemed to matter Stephen A. Smith. By March 6, 2025, during the Lakers and Knicks game, something inside LeBron family snapped. He walked over to where Stephen A was sitting courtside and made it very clear that enough was enough. And what happened after that moment turned this from a simple sports debate into one of the biggest, most personal feuds the NBA world had seen in years. The day after the courtside confrontation, the Stephen A. Smith showed up on the first day and his tone was surprisingly calm at first. He acknowledged that LeBron had approached him, but he framed it in a way that actually made himself look reasonable. He said that what came at him that night wasn't the basketball player, it was father. He said he understood LeBron's feeling and that he had nothing but respect for him as a family man. It must feel like a whole thing was going cool down quietly, but that calm didn't last long because within just a few days, Stephen A. Smith said something that completely changed the temperature of everything. On his own YouTube show, Stephen A. stopped being measured and started being aggressive. He described LeBron's courtside approach as weak. He said that if LeBron had actually touched him during that confrontation, he would have swung back immediately. He even said directly that he told LeBron they could settle it right there in the middle of the court, one on one. Now, everyone watching knew Stephen A. wasn't going to win a physical fight with LeBron James. Stephen A. even admitted that himself, but the fact that he said it at all showed that his feud had moved way beyond basketball. This was no longer about Bronny's stats or his NBA readiness. Had become something personal between two very proud men who both refused to back down. LeBron then went on a Pat McAfee show and fired back in his own way. He was calmer than Stephen A, but though his words were sharp. He said that the moment commentary stopped being about what happened on the court and started getting personal, it became his job to protect his household. He also took a direct jab at Stephen A, but comparing his media tour to a Taylor Swift concert run, basically saying that Stephen was chasing attention and dragging his name along for the ride. That comparison got people talking even more and internet absolutely ran with it. But then came the moment that shifted the entire conversation in the last March 2025 during one of his most heated responses yet. Stephen Smith made a claim that he had nothing to do with the basketball at all. He said on air that LeBron James had not attended Kobe Bryant Memorial Service in 2020. For anyone who understood that Kobe meant to LeBron what that loss meant to the entire basketball world. Those words were devastating. Kobe and LeBron shared a bond that went beyond the court. LeBron had spoken publicly about how much Kobe influenced him and how Stephen was standing on his platform telling the world that LeBron didn't even show up to say goodbye. The backlash was immediate and it was massive. Fans were furious. Media personalities pushed back hard. Within a short time, Stephen Smith was forced to go back on air and retract everything he had said. He admitted he was wrong. He apologized on social media and clarified that LeBron had in fact attended the memorial but had chosen to grieve privately and stay off camera. That retraction said everything because in the heat of this feud, Stephen had gotten so caught up in winning the argument that he started something as fact that simply was not true, and he did it about one of the most emotionally sensitive moments in the recent NBA history. While all of his back and forth was dominating the headlines, there was one person at the center of it all who hadn't really said much publicly, Bronny James, the young man whose NBA career had sparked that biggest sports media feud in the recent memory, was just quietly going about his work, showing up to practice, playing his minutes, and trying to develop as a professional basketball player. And when you actually look at the full picture of what Bronny James was doing, away from the noise and the arguments, the story was a lot more interesting than Stephen A. Smith had made it seem. Yes, Bronny NBA number were low. In 27 appearances with the Lakers, he averaged 2.3 points, 0.7 rebounds, and zero point 0.8 assists. With this shooting percentage weren't going to impress anyone. Those numbers were real and nobody was pretending otherwise. But what a lot of people weren't talking about was what Bronny was doing in the G League with the South Bay Lakers, which is essentially the development league where younger players get more playing time to grow their games. Down there, Bruni was a completely different player. He was averaging 21.9 points, 5.3 rebounds, and 5.3 assists per game, shooting 44% from the field and 38% from 3. Those were not the numbers of a player who didn't belong to professional basketball. Those were the numbers of someone who was developing at a real pace and simplify needed right environment and enough time to get there. There was also a context that kept getting buried under all the drama. Brony had entered USC as a highly regarded prospect, but his entire college career was drilled. By the cardiac arrest in July 2023, he spent 3 days in the hospital. He had to completely rebuild his body and his confidence. He played one college season after that, averaging modest number in the limited minute, and then entered the draft room for a place of significant physical and emotionally recovery. Most of players who go through something that serious don't even make it back onto the court at all, let alone get drafted in NBA, but Bruni did. And yet, the conversation rarely started there. Lakers coach JJ Redick had been watching Bruni closely all season, and what he said was telling. He noted that Bruni's confidence was steadily growing, and the next step for him was becoming an elite conditioned athlete. He also pointed out something that most critics were completely ignoring, which was the Bruni's ability to handle the pressure and security that came with the being LeBron's son was generally impressive because the pressure was unlike anything any other rookie in the 2024 draft class had to deal with. Every single game Bruni played, every shot he took, every mistake he made was being measured not just against other rookies but against the greatest player of all time. That was the weight he was carrying every time. Former NBA star Carmelo Anthony, someone who had spent years at the highest level of the game and understood what it took to develop as a player, went on a record with the prediction that turned a lot of heads. He said that in a couple of years, Bronny James was going to be a real NBA player, a real solid NBA player. Not a star, not a legend, but a legitimate professional who had earned his place in the league through hard work and development. And then came the moment that made even Stephen Smith pause. On April 25th, 2025, Bronny James stepped onto the court against the Milwaukee Bucks and put up 17 points and 5 assists in 30 minutes of play. It was a kind of performance that made people sit up and take notice, and Stephen Smith, to his credit, addressed it directly. He went on air and said something that very few people expected to hear from him. He said that he might have been wrong about Bruni's NBA readiness. For a man who rarely admitted mistakes, especially about LeBron James, those words meant something. By spring of 2025, something interesting had started to happen. The loud daily back and forth between LeBron James and Stephen Smith had begun to quiet down. No more explosive television movement, no more shocking claims being made on air, no more social media posts calling each other out. Both men had gone silent on this topic. But that silence didn't mean the feud was over. It just meant it had gone underground. And what it left behind was a conversation that the entire sports world was still having, because the story had stopped being just about two famous people arguing and had turned into something much deeper. What this whole saga truly exposed was a tension that had been building for years between NBA players and the media personalities who covered them. A comment that spread across social media during the height of the feud captured it perfectly. It said the players had never liked Stephen Smith, that he was never someone they trusted, and that the image of the projected of being deeply connected to the league was largely built on thin air. Kevin Durant had reportedly said before the Stephen lied about the players giving him inside information, and the comment got thousands of upvotes from the fans who had suspected this for years, suggesting that what LeBron did by confronting Stephen courtside was something many players had wanted to do for a long time but never felt they could. Then there was a Kobe Bryant moment, which in many ways was the detail that defined this entire story. Stephen had pushed this feud further and further every single week, making bigger claims each time until they finally said something about LeBron's keeping Kobe memorial that turned out to be completely false. That moment showed what happens when media personality gets so deep into the personal battle that the line between opinion and the fact disappears entirely. Stephen was forced to apologize, and in doing so, he handed LeBron something not courtside confrontation could have given him. He handed him the moral high ground completely and blindly. By the end of it all, Bruni was still in the league, still developing, still putting in the work. LeBron was still playing elite basketball and still protecting his family. And Stephen was still on television every morning, still loud, still controversial. Nothing had been formally resolved between them. No handshake, no sit down, no public reconciliation, just silence. And sometime in a feud, this personal and this public silence is the loudest ending of all.